Now, when the flow of warmer water speeds up in the Atlantic, the Arctic warms up. This is the Gulf Stream right here. This is very crude, but roughly the water does this, pumped up from the Gulf Stream and up into the Arctic. And again, we look at the water temperatures. The Atlantic began warming around 1977. It bottomed out, and then you can see it began to work its way up. And it's around this time that the Arctic temperature began to rise, right around 1980. The same thing happened from 1917 to the mid-1940s. The Atlantic was warming. And in fact, the Arctic temperature during that time increased 9 degrees Fahrenheit. See, according to information received from the USSR in 1945, the area of drift ice in the Russian sector of the Arctic was reduced by no less than 1 million square kilometers between 1924 and 1944. Findings of the Soviet explorers aboard the icebreaker Sedov, now drifting within 300 miles of the North Pole, together with earlier observations by other investigators, have caused Soviet scientists to conclude that the Arctic region, and indeed the whole world, is growing warmer. December the 12th, 1938. In fact, half of the global warming since 1850 was from 1910 to 1945. Now, the North Atlantic Ocean was cooling from 1950 to 1975, generating more ice in the Arctic. In fact, at that point in time, everybody was talking about another ice age coming. The Times Daily in London, 1972, expert claims ice age creeping up. In New Scientist magazine, 1975, the threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and destruction and misery for mankind. In the 1960s and 70s, scientists, television, radio, newspapers, and magazines were telling us another ice age was at hand. But it never happened. So here's September 1979, how much ice there is. After 3 decades of global cooling, of course, there was much more ice in the Arctic. September 2007, much less. Since then, the amount of ice has decreased because the Atlantic was warming. So the North Atlantic Ocean has been much warmer since the mid-1990s, reducing the amount of Arctic ice. But notice that the decrease in the ice started after the Atlantic became warmer than the long-term average. So it was right in the mid-90s where we started to see the drop-off. Now, the entire history of measured Arctic sea ice only started a short time ago, not long enough to see the changes caused by longer ocean cycles. That's because in 1979, we put the first polar orbiting satellites up. For the first time, we could see all the ice. Before that, you couldn't. So our knowledge of the ice in the Arctic is extremely limited. The loss of Arctic sea ice has stopped. It bottomed out in 2007 and has actually recovered some since then. And then there's Antarctica. This is Antarctic temperature since 1957 to now. It's basically the same. But look at the huge variations. In fact, winters of the South Pole are getting colder. The 2004 winter at the South Pole was the coldest ever, but it never made the news. If it had been the warmest, it would have. Record amount of sea ice surrounding Antarctica in 2007 never made the news. But the record low amount in the Arctic did. There's been no decrease. In fact, there's been an increase in sea ice surrounding Antarctica for the last decade. Again, never reported by the news media. What about the glaciers? Well, as I said, we've been recovering from the bottom of the Little Ice Age now for 300 years. Here's a glacier in 1941. There's the same place today. Here's a glacier in 1928, the same place today. Here's a report from the Associated Press. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers all point to a radical change in climate conditions and unheard-of temperatures in the Arctic. Great masses of ice have been replaced by moraines of earth and stones, while at many points well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. This was in the Washington Post, November the 2nd, 1922. That's when we were in that period of rapid global warming from 1910 to 1945. New York Times. A new chapter written by the glaciers, The Retreat of Ice Rivers in the Alps, emphasizes the influence they exert on climate and migrations. Now in full retreat in the Alps. Word comes from Switzerland that the Alpine glaciers are in full retreat. Out of 102 glaciers observed by Professor Mercantin of the University of Lausanne and his associates, more than two-thirds have been found to be shrinking. December the 21st, 1930. It's not new. The Gangotri Glacier in the Himalayas has been retreating since 1780. The Warren Glacier in the western British Columbia Rockies has been receding since 1705. Now this is a little confusing looking, but what it is the Swiss glacier advance and retreat with the changes in the Atlantic Ocean temperature. When the water in red is cooler, the glaciers in blue advanced in the Alps. When the Atlantic warmed up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, most of the glaciers were retreating. Then when the water got cooler again in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the glaciers advanced again. Now they've been receding because the temperature is cyclically warming again. Mount Kilimanjaro. The average temperature on top of Mount Kilimanjaro is 21 degrees. The ice is not melting, it's evaporating. Drought from deforestation is shrinking the glaciers on Kilimanjaro. Large areas have been cleared around the mountain for ranching and farming, changing the local climate, making it drier. This shows the retreat of glaciers started nearly 200 years ago, long before any possible human impact, when the Little Ice Age was coming to an end. So melting of glaciers are constantly used as proof of man-made global warming. They are not. The oceans contain 1,000 times more heat than the atmosphere, most of it stored in the tropics. We have more than 3,200 buoys around the world that dive down 6,000 feet, measure temperature and salinity, come back to the surface, radio that information to a satellite, then to a ground station. They show, since at least when they were deployed in 2003, that the oceans are not warming rapidly. In fact, not at all. Now, the Pacific Ocean is the biggest ocean in the world, and it warms up and cools off for 25 to 30-year periods. It's called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This is the area we're looking at, in the tropics, where most of the heat is stored. When the Pacific was warmer from the 1920s, 30s, and into the mid-40s, the temperature of the Earth went up. Then, when the Pacific cooled off in the mid-40s to the mid-70s, the temperature eased down from 46 to 75. It was during this colder period that we began to hear about the next ice age coming, which also was popular back from the late 1880s into the mid-19-teens, by the way. January of 1977 was one of the coldest months in the United States in the last 150 years. People were sailing on the Potomac River, ice sailing. In 1977, there were massive blizzards. In 1978, in the New York Times, an international team of specialists concluded from 8 indices of climate there was no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years. In the 1960s and 70s, they were all telling us another ice age was at hand. They were all wrong. All. Because they didn't know about the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. They didn't know the ocean warmed up in the mid-70s to the late 90s, and the temperature went up again. And that's when we began to hear about global warming. See, the way the media treats it is, if it's getting colder, they think an ice age is coming. If it's getting warmer, they think we're going to fry. Time is running out. Stop global warming. That's all happened since the late 70s. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course the development of carbon financial instruments in Wall Street to make money from carbon trading. And of course the idea of climate debt. The third world countries now say the developed nations owe climate debt to them for using up all the carbon space in the air. They want $100 billion a year. They may be poor, but they're not stupid.